David, why would they not want background checks?
I don't know that the Senate Republicans would hold that position at all. I could see
why would the Trump team not want it? Excuse me.
Yeah, I can't come up with a good reason. So you can see why I immediately moved to Senate Republicans, because there is no, Katie, I mean, all kidding aside here, there's no good reason. If you're Donald Trump and these positions matter to you, which they do, and they're important governmental positions that are going to help you govern and push your agenda forward, you need to know what you're dealing with so that you don't get tripped up the way the former and future president was the first time around. He hired a national security advisor, didn't have all of the relevant information he needed. 3 weeks later, he had to change course and replace somebody. The last thing he needs is for the Secretary of Defense or the Director of National Intelligence to be, a few weeks or a few months into the job, and all of a sudden news breaks that completely overshadows what he's actually trying to do as president. Not only does he have to replace a key advisor, but his agenda gets sidetracked. And of course, nobody in Congress that's going to vote for these people wants to be on the hook for a mistake. So there is no reason. I could see politically within the MAGA movement, there's a high suspicion of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Some of Trump's supporters want the FBI shut down. But the fact that Trump's hiring for FBI director tells us that's not going to happen. And so if he's going to be in charge of the FBI, I cannot really come up with a good reason not to do this unless he's conducting his own via private methods. And even then, it's something that needs to get done.
Yeah, but a private security check is not going to be the same as a FBI background check. They don't have access, I imagine, to the same information. Tom Nichols, let me ask you that same question. Can you come up with a reason?
Sure. If you don't want your nominees vetted by the FBI, it's because you're concerned that there are landmines in their personal bios that you don't want to come out and, have blow up their nomination. Look, when I lived in Vermont years ago, and my next door neighbor was the former governor of Vermont, Madeleine Kunin. It just happened that way. And she was up to be nominated, I think, for Secretary of Education. And federal agents literally came to my door and said, the governor's been nominated for something, this nice, elderly lady who lives next to you in Vermont. Anything you want to tell us? Even because it's not just for national secrets. Every cabinet member has access to the White House, to the immediate proximity of the President of the United States. Of course you check everybody out, whether it's the former governor of Vermont for Secretary of Education or someone who's going to be running the biggest bureaucracy and the most powerful military in the world. And if, it should be an immediate red flag to say, okay, there's some people I don't want the FBI to look into, because that's because that bad things are going to happen, which says that the initial process that produced these names was basically Trump saying, I just like these people, and now they're stuck. And I want to emphasize David's point that the senators, I worked for a senator, none of them want to be voting blind and then a month later be on the hook when someone says, so this terrible thing that just happened, that we now know about one of, these confirmed cabinet members, you voted for that person and you did it without any information. What does that say about you, Senator? And there is no senator of any party who wants to be that guy at that moment.
Garrett, you want to chime in on this? Any insight into the Trump team and their thinking and whether they have any worry about senators pushing back on the FBI background check?
Well, look, I think David got to this towards the end of his response. The reason that Trump doesn't trust the FBI is because 2 years ago they raided his house. I mean, Trump has a deep distrust for the FBI specifically and the Department of Justice more broadly, and he doesn't want them looking around in the files and backgrounds of the people he wants to put into his cabinet and his administration, who he thinks will help then take those organizations apart to a certain degree. All of the risks of that strategy notwithstanding, I think that's a big part about how Donald Trump looks at this. But the challenge that he's going to run into, as Tom got to, is that his nominees are now going to be hanging out there, twisting in the wind in some cases for months until they're able to have their confirmation hearings. And when lawmakers come back into town next week, they're going to be asked about this, because even some of the most pro-Trump lawmakers in the Senate who are going to be casting votes on this don't necessarily have the same anti-FBI feelings that Trump does. They're going to want to know who they're voting for and what's coming across the transom. They don't want another Mike Flynn situation, who was not a Senate-confirmed nominee, but obviously had things come up in his background from FBI issues that ultimately led to a conviction for him, to pardon later by Trump. That's not a risk that elected senators want to take, and I think the pressure will build over time before these people actually get in front of confirmation hearings to get some kind of background checks that will satisfy the Senate Judiciary, Finance, Help committees who are going to be looking at some of these more controversial nominees.
Tom, I want to go back to Keith Kellogg and this Ukraine-Russia position that Donald Trump is going to task him with. So Kellogg outlined what his would-be plan would be if he were in charge. This was part of the AFI or AFP Institute. And it's a paper, and he says, we tell the Ukrainians, you got to come to the table, and if you don't come to the table, support from the U.S. will dry up. He also says, you tell Putin he's got to come to the table, and if you don't come to the table, then we'll give Ukrainians everything they need to kill you in the field. There would also be something about NATO, that Moscow would be coaxed to the table with the promise of NATO membership for Ukraine being put off for an extended period. It sounds like this is giving Vladimir Putin a whole lot of what he would want, which is freezing the battle lines where they currently are, which means Russia gets more territory, and putting off NATO membership, which is said to be very, very uncomfortable, angering for Moscow, for Vladimir Putin. They don't want more NATO members in Europe. They specifically don't want Ukraine to be a member of NATO.
Okay, first of all, the whole NATO membership thing was, the kind of thing that was aspirational until Russia invaded. I mean, the idea that, Ukraine in any reasonable time frame was ever going to become a part of NATO, especially with Crimea still occupied, was really not something that was going to happen anytime soon. The Russians knew it. They ginned up this whole thing about, well, we have to invade because we've been provoked by this, this possibility that in the next 10 minutes, Ukraine's going to join NATO. The only reason that now Ukraine has a better shot at NATO membership is because the Russians have scared the daylights out of everybody by proving that they are exactly the aggressive menace that everybody thought they were, years ago. And Putin keeps playing to that, playing that out and showing that he's exactly why NATO exists. The Russia that I was actually a go slow NATO guy back in the 90s. Putin has talked me out of it. Putin has shown that there's a reason NATO still exists even after the Cold War, and the war in Ukraine is part of it. As for the Kellogg plan, it's great for Putin. It freezes the conflict in place, which works to his advantage so that he can rearm, get a breather, get more troops up to the line, and then start again, just as he's done in other conflicts. He'll say, well, I came to the table, the Ukrainians didn't live up to their side of it, now I have to start hostilities again. This Kellogg plan, insofar as it's a plan, first of all, I don't believe for one moment that they're going to say, oh, Russia didn't come to the table, we're going to flood Ukraine with weapons. I think that's an empty threat. And I think, just as Garrett was talking about how much the Trump people don't like the FBI. They have no love for Ukraine either. Remember, trying to pressure Ukraine is how Trump got impeached the first time.
Yeah.
And they're carrying that grudge with them.
Is there a Western Europe wrinkle to this, Tom? I mean, if there's pushback, any meaningful pushback from our allies in France, in the UK, and Germany, to Keith Kellogg going over there and trying to freeze the borders and forestall NATO membership for Ukraine, could there be blowback from them toward the U.S. that might change the calculation?
Sure. They could easily say, okay, well, the United States is proposing this. The Ukrainians don't want to do it. We'll keep sending weapons and money to Ukraine. One of the myths here is and you mentioned this earlier in your report, Kellogg says, well, we can't afford to keep doing this. 5% of the U.S. defense budget has destroyed about half of Russia's military capability in this war. We are a wealthy country. The Europeans are a wealthy country. This isn't costing us that much money. That's an old saw. And it's kind of interesting because it's the way that conservatives used to argue with liberals to say, we have plenty of money for guns and butter here. But this is not this isn't like the Iraq War where we're, thinking of mobilizing huge resources of U.S. government.
On that point, one of the arguments that Donald Trump and his allies have made about the wars in Ukraine, the war in Israel, is that we shouldn't be focused on stuff happening overseas. We should be focused on problems here at home. That money would be better spent here at home. If that money is not spent on arming Ukraine or on sending arms to Israel, does that money get redirected toward welfare programs? Does it go into Social Security or Medicaid? Does it go to a child tax credit? Does it go to paid parental leave for everybody in this country?
Yeah, this is one of the oldest false choices in American politics. This is something that happens, every 4 years. If only we weren't spending the money here, we'd be spending the money there. If only we weren't sending it to this country, we'd be, spending it. First of all, Americans need to understand that foreign aid is actually money spent in the United States. A lot of the weapons, Senator Tuberville had a comment the other day about this, apparently unaware that many of the weapons that are bought and sent to Ukraine are made in Alabama. People don't realize that most of American foreign aid, which is less than 1% of our budget, is spent in the United States on American workers for American products. And the idea that you can simply say, well, things happening in other parts of the world will never affect us is foolish and short-sighted. And again, it's an old isolationist tactic to say, oh, we shouldn't be concerned.
Yeah.
We have to care more about Paris. We shouldn't care about Paris. We have to care about Ohio. That's a false choice, and it's always been a bad.
Not Paris, France. Paris, Texas, maybe.